When we think of nationalism, we often picture the 19th or 20th century, but the seeds of nationalist resistance, especially resistance against the universal claims of the Roman Catholic Church, go back centuries earlier. One of the clearest early examples, the Hussite Revolution. This video argues that the Hussite Revolution was not an isolated Czech phenomenon, but part of a larger ongoing trend of proto-nationalist sentiment that rose in contradiction to the Catholic Church's universalist global mission. From regional theological movements to monarchs resisting papal authority, this resistance through not nationalism as we understood it today already began eroding the spiritual unity of Christendom. I also argue that this growing trend of national identity asserting itself against the authority of Rome constitutes a kind of Proto-Enlightenment. The Reformation, often thought of as a purely religious movement, was also deeply connected to this trajectory. The Enlightenment would later secularize and institutionalize many of these themes, including nationalism itself, but the pattern begins earlier. So by looking at the Hussites and similar movements, we can trace how the modern order's skeptical or universal truth and centralized religion's authority was seated in medieval soil. In the late Middle Ages, Christendom faced multiple internal crises. The Avignon papacy from 1309 to 1377 relocated the seat of the Pope to France, drawing criticism of foreign domination. Then came the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, where rival popes competed for legitimacy. These fractures made people question whether the Church truly represented a unified spiritual authority or it had become entangled in politics and foreign control. While some regions remained steadfast in their loyalty to Rome, others began to see the papacy as increasingly compromised by secular entanglements. John Huss, inspired by English reformer John Wycliffe, began preaching against church corruption indulgences in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. But his critique wasn't just theological, it was also national. Huss accused the church of being under foreign influence and argued for a Bohemian Christianity that wasn't beholden to Rome. While he was undoubtedly motivated by theological ideas, his message resonated with growing resentment towards German clergy and outside interference. He was condemned at the Council of Constance and burned at the stake in 1415. The reaction, armed rebellion. He became a martyr to that Czech nationalism even back then. The Hussite Revolution from 1419 to 1434 was both a theological and a national uprising. Czech rebels, especially the radical Taborites, fought for control of their own liturgy, the right to receive communion in both kinds, and freedom from Roman-imposed clergy. At the Battle of Lipany in 1434, modern Hussites defeated the more radical wing. While the Catholic Church would eventually reassert itself in Bohemia, the revolution proved that ecclesial rebellion in the name of national identity could temporarily succeed. It left a powerful legacy of theological independence tied to political and cultural autonomy. But Huss wasn't the first to challenge Rome through localized or national expression. Consider the Celtic Christianity from 15th to 17th centuries. Irish and Scottish Christians developed unique liturgies and ecclesiastical traditions. The Synod of Whitby, 664, marked their forced alignment with Roman customs, revealing early tensions between local Christian identity and Roman authority. So these are examples of proto-Enlightenment nationalistic sentiments and movements that arose because of them. Another one is the Sicilian Vespers from 1282. A nationalist revolt against French Angevin rule backed by the Pope signaled growing resentment of papal involvement in local politics. The massacre was not just political, it was also a rejection of papal interference via foreign conciliarism. From 14th to 15th centuries, a movement that tried to subordinate the Pope to church councils often aligned with royal and national interests. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, attempted this, showing cracks in the hierarchical structure of church authority. These early resistances weren't purely spiritual, they reflected a growing desire for national religious identity, an identity free from Rome's authority, taxation, and control. Whether it was Anglo-Saxon bishops replaced by Normans post-1066 or the Czech refusal to accept German clergy, the message was clear. Rome was seen by many as foreigners, and resistance to it was increasingly viewed as patriotic. Still, it is important to recognize that many others, such as the Poles, Hungarians, and Spanish, remained loyal to the church, seeing it as legitimate spiritual authority rather than external overload. These early ruptures foreshadowed the Reformation. Luther, Calvin, and others would later wrap their theological arguments in similar language, attacking corruption, but often aligning with princes who gained land and power by breaking from Rome. Yet we must also acknowledge that some reformers acted from genuine theological conviction and spiritual yearning, not simply opportunism. The Hussites were not just rebels, they were a blueprint, a populist movement tying theology to political autonomy. It was the birth of a new political theology, one where the nation would slowly begin to challenge and eventually replace the church as the primary source of communal identity. Heads of principalities would use these events for their own gain and for the purpose of looting. And if you saw part 1 of this series, you understand that the Reformation was, though there was theological disputes, obviously, it was mainly used to loot and erode the church's influence. Before Luther, before Calvin, before the Enlightenment, there was John Huss, and before the modern nation state, there was movements like the Hussite Rebellion that challenged the very foundation of Christian unity. In challenging the universal church, nationalism first appeared not as secular atheism, but as religious rebellion. In the name of the people, and every such rebellion, consciously or not, chipped away at the sacred glue that once held Christendom together. Seen through the lens of history, these movements were not isolated, they were part of a chronoprophetic pattern. Movements in times that foreshadowed the deeper rebellion, the slow erosion of Christendom through localized, ego-driven autonomy, and they helped us understand why modern nationalism and Enlightenment secularism found such fertile ground in post-Reformation Europe. Nationalism is important, but the reason one does not want to indulge completely into it is because it can become idolatry of the state, and that can become tricky. You never want to supersede God's church on earth with idolizing the state and its people, but it must be important to acknowledge your own nation and your own people, your own state, because otherwise you get what you see in modern times, and nationalism is completely quelled and dispersed by, subterfuge and all these things. And even the most so-called right-wing movements are not even close to nationalists. But point being is, you got to find a middle ground. You got to recognize that you have your own borders, your own nation, your own state, and very importantly, your own people. But it can never supersede one's church. So I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe for more.